My son sold my priceless Mustang while I was helpless in a hospital bed, recovering from having my chest cracked open for heart surgery. He thought he'd gotten away with it, but his victory soured the moment the police knocked on his door. So I made one anonymous phone call that turned the car into the star witness of a 30-year-old cold case. Before we dive into this intense story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We'd also love to know where you're all tuning in from. Let us know in the comments. The first coherent thought I had in the ICU was not about the searing pain in my chest or the rhythmic, intrusive beep of the heart monitor. It was of her. A flash of Highland green paint catching the afternoon sun, the glint of chrome on a perfect summer day, the low, contented rumble of a 289 V8 engine. My 1967 Mustang. For a man who had just had his heart literally stopped and restarted, it was a strange thing to cling to, but the car was more than just metal and paint to me. She was a time capsule, a promise, a memorial. 20 years of my life were poured into her restoration, sanding down old sins and polishing memories until they shone. The sterile, white room was a prison of stillness. Tubes snaked from my arms and my chest felt like it had been shattered and crudely glued back together. Every breath was a negotiation with a sharp, deep ache. I was 58 years old, a retired mechanical engineer who had always prided himself on his steady hands and methodical mind, now reduced to a fragile patient who couldn't even sit up without a nurse's help. The doctors called the triple bypass a success, a textbook procedure. But as I lay there, I felt less like a man who'd been saved, and more like a delicate piece of machinery that could break at the slightest touch. My son, Ethan, was supposed to be looking after the house. At 32, he was all sharp suits and sharper ambition, a real estate agent chasing commissions in a brutal market. He had a way of talking that was all confidence and jargon, a language of leveraging assets and maximizing potential that I, a man of gears and grease, never quite understood. He visited every day, his phone buzzing incessantly, his presence a whirlwind of restless energy that felt out of place in the deliberate calm of the cardiac wing. It was on the fifth day, when the fog of anesthesia had finally lifted, that he dropped the bomb. He walked in, not with the usual strained smile, but with an almost manic brightness in his eyes. He was practically bouncing on the balls of his expensive Italian shoes. "Dad, you're looking better. The color is coming back to your face," he said, pulling the visitor's chair close to my bed. I managed a weak nod. "The nurses are taking good care of me." "That's great, that's really great," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Listen, I have some fantastic news, something that's going to make your recovery so much easier. No more stress for us, for either of us." I waited, my heart doing a slow, heavy thump against my ribs that the monitor dutifully reported. I assumed he'd finally closed a big sale, a mansion in the hills that would solve his perpetual money problems. He was always one deal away from striking it rich, or so he said. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I solved our cash flow problem, permanently." "What did you do, Ethan?" My own voice was a dry rasp. His smile was wide and triumphant. "I sold the Mustang." The words didn't compute at first. They floated in the air between us, nonsensical like a sentence in a foreign language. The Mustang, my brother David's Mustang. The beeping of the monitor beside me seemed to quicken, a frantic, electronic pulse echoing the sudden chaos in my mind. "You what?" "I sold it," he repeated, his grin unwavering. He clearly expected me to be thrilled. "I got a fantastic price for it, Dad. A collector from out of state. Paid cash. More than enough to clear up all my debt and leave a nice cushion for you so you don't have to worry about a thing while you're getting back on your feet." I stared at him. The room felt like it was tilting, the crisp, white walls closing in. He hadn't just sold a car. He had sold 20 years of my weekends. He had sold the last tangible piece of my brother. He had taken a sacred object and slapped a price tag on it. He had done this while I lay helpless, my life literally in the hands of surgeons. He must have seen the change in my expression, the utter devastation that I was too weak to hide. His smile faltered. "Dad, isn't this great? It was just sitting in the garage collecting dust. An asset just sitting there. Julian, my mentor, he said it was the smartest move I could make." Julian Croft. The name dripped with the memory of cheap cologne and predatory advice. I'd met him once. It was enough. I didn't have the strength to yell, to rage, to arctic. Ulate the colossal scale of his betrayal. All the energy I possessed was being used to keep my stitched-together chest from flying apart. So I did the only thing I could. I closed my eyes, shutting out his expectant face, shutting out the sterile room, shutting out the world. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the stubble on my cheek. "Okay," I whispered, the word barely audible. "Okay, Ethan." He took it as acceptance, as approval. "Oh, that's great, Dad. I knew you'd understand. It's for the best, you'll see." He patted my hand, the one with the IV line, and I flinched. He didn't notice. He was already pulling out his phone, already moving on to the next transaction, the next deal. He was thrilled with the cash, a son celebrating a victory on the ashes of his father's heart. He didn't know what he had done. He didn't know what he had set in motion. He thought he had sold a car. He had no idea he had just released a ghost. The loss of the car was devastating, but the betrayal from my own son felt fatal. They discharged me a week later, with a list of instructions as long as my arm and a stern warning to avoid any stress. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. My son, my own flesh and blood, had just detonated a stress bomb in the center of my life, and I was supposed to spend my days in quiet contemplation and gentle walks. The house felt cavernous and wrong. Every room echoed with a profound silence that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall only amplified. But the garage was a tomb. I stood at the doorway, leaning heavily on the cane they'd given me, and stared at the empty space. For 2 decades, that spot had been occupied by the Highland green chassis of the Mustang. It was where I'd gone to think, to remember, to lose myself in the methodical work of bringing something beautiful back to life. I could still see the oil stain on the concrete, a faint, dark map of where her engine had rested. The air, which should have smelled of gasoline, wax, and old leather, was now just stale and empty. My sanctuary had been desecrated. Ethan had left a folder on the kitchen table. Inside was a bank statement showing a recent deposit of a staggering amount, and a smaller, separate account opened in my name with a cushion of $20,000. He'd even left a note, written in his scrolling, impatient hand. "See, Dad, all taken care of. Focus on getting better." He thought this pile of paper could replace what he'd taken. He thought money was the universal solvent for guilt and grief. He called me that evening, his voice buzzing with the same frantic energy he'd had at the hospital. "How's the first day back, old man?" he asked, the term of endearment landing like a punch. "Quiet," I said, my voice flat. I was sitting in my worn armchair, staring at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of me and my younger brother, David, taken in the summer of 1989. We were teenagers, leaning against the very same Mustang, then still new and full of promise. David had his arm slung over my shoulder, a cocky, joyful grin on his face. He'd vanished a year later. "Good, good, that's what you need," Ethan said, oblivious. "Hey, I wanted to let you know, Julian and I are moving forward on that new development project. The cash from the car, man, it was perfect timing. Julian says I have a real killer instinct for business." My hand tightened on the receiver. "Is that what he calls it, a killer instinct?" "Yeah, seeing an opportunity and seizing it, not letting sentimentality get in the way of a profit." He laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of any real humor. "You should have seen the buyer, Dad. He didn't even haggle, just wired the money. Julian handled the whole thing, made sure it was all clean and fast." Clean and fast. That's how they disposed of 20 years of my life, of David's memory. My grief was so immense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my fragile chest. But beneath the grief, a cold, hard resolve was beginning to form. It was a familiar feeling, the quiet determination of an engineer presented with a complex problem. The problem wasn't just a stolen car. It was a son who had lost his way, a memory that had been dishonored, and a 30-year-old wound that had never been allowed to heal. Ethan chattered on about interest rates and zoning permits, his words a meaningless drone in my ear. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't mention the car again. To him, the transaction was complete. It was a closed chapter. But he and his mentor Julian had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten what that car truly represented. They had forgotten about David. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the silence for a long time, the photograph of my brother watching over me. Ethan saw a classic car, an underutilized asset. Julian saw a quick commission. The collector saw a beautiful piece of machinery. They were all wrong. I saw a crime scene, a 30-year-old, perfectly preserved, rolling piece of evidence. And in that moment, staring at the empty space in my garage, I knew what I had to do. The grief was still there, a howling empty space in my heart. But now it had a purpose. It was no longer just a project of restoration. It was now a project of justice. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought the money was his. But the gears were already turning in my mind. A plan, intricate and precise, began to take shape. A plan that would be set in motion not by yelling or arguments, but by a quiet, anonymous phone call. They thought the story of that Mustang was over. It was just beginning. The 1967 Ford Mustang wasn't mine to begin with. It was David's. My parents bought it for him as a high school graduation present, a symbol of the bright, open road of his future. He loved that car with the fierce, proprietary passion only a 17-year-old can have. We called it the Ghost, not because it was spooky, but because its Highland green paint seemed to shift and shimmer in the light, sometimes looking almost silver, like a phantom streaking down the road. David was the charismatic one, the daredevil. I was the quiet older brother, the one who checked the oil and made sure the tire pressure was right. Our world shattered in the autumn of 1990. David, then 18, disappeared. One night he drove the Ghost to meet some people I warned him about, and he never came home. The car was found a week later, abandoned in a long-term parking lot near the old freight yards. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, just an empty car and a family's life torn apart. The police investigated, but the trail went cold almost immediately. David was filed away as a voluntary disappearance, another kid who'd run off for a new life. I never believed it. David wouldn't have left the Ghost behind. My parents, broken by grief, couldn't bear to look at the car. It sat in their garage under a dusty tarp for years, a monument to our loss. After they passed, the car became mine. For a long time, I couldn't touch it either. But as the years passed, the pain began to curdle into a different kind of emotion, a slow-burning, unresolved anger, a need for answers. Around the time Ethan was in middle school, I towed the Ghost to my own garage and began the slow, painstaking process of restoration. It was my therapy. Every bolt I unscrewed, every panel I sanded, was a question I was asking the past. It was during that restoration, about 10 years in, that I found it. I was replacing the worn-out trunk liner when my fingers brushed against something that didn't feel right. Behind the wheel well, tucked deep inside a cavity in the chassis, was a small, crudely welded metal box, painted black to blend in with the shadows. It wasn't a factory part. It was a hidden compartment. My heart hammered in my chest as I pried it open. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton, was a small, silver locket. It was our mother's, one she had given to David. And tangled in its delicate chain was a single strand of long, dark hair. It wasn't David's and it wasn't mine. I knew in that instant that I was holding a piece of the puzzle. But what could I do? March into the police station 30 years after the fact and say I'd found a secret compartment in my brother's car? They would ask why it took me so long. They would ask if I'd put it there myself. My story would be dismissed, and worse, the evidence could be compromised, lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. The man I suspected was behind David's disappearance was a local businessman named Alastair Finch, a figure who had always been surrounded by rumors of crime but was as slick and untouchable as polished granite. He was the one David was supposed to meet that night. An accusation from me, based on a hidden locket, would go nowhere. So I closed the box, sealed the panel, and continued the restoration. I held my secret, waiting for a moment and opportunity that I thought might never come. Then came Julian Croft. Ethan brought him to the house for dinner about 6 months before my surgery. Julian was the kind of man who looked you in the eye while he was picking your pocket. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a smile that never reached his eyes and a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He called himself a wealth management consultant, but he spoke like a vulture circling a fresh kill. He walked around my home with a proprietary air, his eyes scanning everything, not with appreciation, but with calculation. He complimented my wife's porcelain collection by asking if it was insured. He admired my grandfather's watch by guessing its resale value. When Ethan, beaming with pride, showed him the Mustang in the garage, Julian's reaction was chilling. He circled the car slowly, his hand hovering over the perfect paint job but never touching it. A beautiful machine, Charles. Truly a passion project. He turned to me, his smile thin. But passions don't pay the bills, do they? An asset like this just sitting here, it's dead money. Think of the liquidity locked up in this thing. It's not about money, I said, my voice tight. It's my brother's. Julian exchanged a look with Ethan, a subtle, dismissive glance that said, "See, old-fashioned thinking." "Of course sentiment is important," Julian said, his tone condescending. "But sometimes, for the good of the family's future, we have to be pragmatic. Ethan has so much potential. He just needs a little capital to get his ventures off the ground. A car is a car. A legacy is built with capital." I hated him instantly. I saw him for exactly what he was, a parasite who fed on the ambitions and insecurities of young men like my son. After he left, I warned Ethan. I told him Julian was a shark who saw him as nothing more than a meal. Ethan, of course, defended him passionately. "You don't get it, Dad," he'd argued. "Julian is teaching me how to be successful. You're just stuck in the past with your old car and your old ways of thinking." He was right about one thing. I was stuck in the past. I was stuck in the autumn of 1990, waiting for a brother who never came home. Julian Croft saw a car. Ethan saw a solution to his debts. Neither of them understood they were tampering with something sacred. When Ethan told me he'd sold the Ghost, the first person I pictured was not the collector who bought it, but Julian Croft, smiling that cold, dead smile, having finally convinced my son to trade his soul for a bank deposit. He was the true antagonist, the architect of my son's betrayal, and he had just handed me the key to unlocking the past. For 3 days I did nothing. I shuffled around my silent house, took my medication, and tried to eat the bland, heart-healthy meals I was prescribed. I was a man adrift, floating in a sea of grief and betrayal. The empty space in the garage was a physical ache, a phantom limb that throbbed with memory. But on the 4th day, something shifted. The engineer in my brain, the part of me that sees problems not as dead ends but as systems waiting to be solved, finally kicked into gear. The turning point came when I found one of David's old mixtapes in a box of junk. The label, written in his messy scrawl, read "Ghost Tunes." I put it in the old cassette player in my workshop. As the tinny sound of an old rock song filled the air, the grief didn't lessen, but it sharpened. It focused into a single, pointed objective: justice for David. Ethan and Julian thought they were clever. They saw me as a weak, sick old man, easily pushed aside. They had made a critical error. They underestimated me. They assumed my love for the car was purely sentimental. They had no idea it was also strategic. I sat down at my desk, my movements slow but deliberate. I turned on my computer and began my investigation. Not into Ethan, not into Julian, but into the local police department. I needed a name, not just any officer, but the right one. I searched for the cold case unit, my fingers tapping slowly on the keyboard. After an hour of navigating municipal websites, I found him, Detective Frank Harding. His bio was short and to the point. 35 years on the force, head of the Homicide Cold Case Division for the last 10, an expert in unresolved investigations. He had a reputation for being methodical, stubborn, and immune to local politics. He was perfect. The next step was the most crucial. I couldn't just call him. I had to create a firewall between Charles Reed, the grieving father, and the source of the information. I drove to a convenience store on the other side of town and bought a cheap, prepaid burner phone, the kind you see in spy movies. It felt absurd but necessary. Back in my workshop, I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand, my newly repaired heart, thumping a steady, heavy rhythm. I wrote down what I was going to say, editing the words until they were precise and clinical. No emotion, just facts. I dialed the number for Harding's direct line, which I'd found on an old departmental newsletter. I used a handkerchief to hold the phone, a ridiculous precaution that nonetheless made me feel more in control. It rang 3 times before a gruff, tired voice answered. Harding. Detective Harding, I began, my voice altered, pitched a little lower, a little rougher. I have information regarding the 1990 disappearance of David Reed. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling. Okay, he said, his voice instantly more alert. Who is this? That's not important, I said, sticking to my script. What's important is the car. A 1967 Ford Mustang Highland Green. His brother restored it. It was just sold within the last 2 weeks to a collector out of state. The bill of sale will have been filed by a real estate agent named Ethan Reed. Anoth. Paused longer this time. I could almost hear the detective's mind working, connecting the dots. Why are you telling me this? What about the car? This was the critical line. I had to give him enough to hook him, but not so much that it led back to me. The people David was involved with before he disappeared. They were not sentimental. If something happened to him in that car, they would have been thorough. But maybe not thorough enough. Maybe they didn't know about the custom work his brother did over the years. Some things get hidden deep. What things? Harding pressed, his voice sharp with interest. You're the detective, I said coolly. Impound the car, take it apart, every last bolt. You'll find what you're looking for. Before he could ask another question, I ended the call and immediately turned off the phone, removing the battery and the SIM card. I wrapped them separately in the handkerchief and buried them deep in the bottom of my kitchen trash can. It was done, the trap was set. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, so profound I had to grip the edge of my workbench to stay upright. I had just pointed a loaded cannon at my own son, but the real target was Alastair Finch and the corrupt silence that had protected him for 3 decades. Ethan was just the fuse, a foolish, greedy fuse that I myself had lit. Now all I could do was wait. I was no longer a passive victim. I was an active strategist, a player in a game 30 years in the making. I waited for the inevitable phone call, the panicked, furious call from my son when he realized the classic car he'd sold for a quick buck was now Exhibit A in a murder investigation. The thought gave me no pleasure, only a grim, hollow sense of necessity. The silence lasted for 4 excruciating days. Every time the phone rang, my stomach clenched. I imagined detectives swarming the collector's pristine garage, flashing a warrant. I pictured the Mustang being loaded onto a flatbed truck, draped in a police tarp, no longer a classic but a piece of evidence. I imagined the phone call from the bewildered buyer to the man who sold it to him, to Ethan. The call finally came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the garden trying to find some measure of peace in the simple act of pulling weeds when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen read, ETHAN. I took a deep, steadying breath, reminding myself to stay calm, to play the part of the confused, aggrieved father. I let it ring 3 more times before answering. Hello, Ethan. Dad, His voice was a raw nerve, high-pitched and frantic. There was no greeting, no preamble. "The car. The police are calling about the car. What did you do?" The accusation was immediate. In his mind, I was the only possible source of this trouble. I feigned confusion, injecting a note of weary frustration into my voice. "What are you talking about? What about the car? You're the one who sold it." "They're asking questions. The buyer called me screaming. He said detectives showed up with a warrant and impounded the Mustang. They said it's connected to an ongoing investigation. He's threatening to sue me for fraud. Dad, this is a disaster. Julian is furious." Ah, Julian. Of course, the puppet master would be upset that his scheme had gone awry. "An investigation," I said, letting a note of alarm seep into my voice. "What kind of investigation?" "I don't know, they wouldn't tell him. But they asked about you, they asked about when you got the car. They asked about Uncle David." He spat the name out like it was a foreign object in his mouth. He barely remembered David, only as a faded photograph, a sad family story he'd never paid much attention to. This was the moment, the first turn of the screw. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, long enough for his panic to build. When I finally spoke, my voice was low and heavy with a grief he had never once considered. "Ethan, why do you think I spent 20 years of my life restoring that specific car?" "What? I don't know, because you like old cars. What does that have to do with anything?" "That car," I said, my voice cracking with genuine emotion, "was the last place anyone ever saw your Uncle David alive. It belonged to him. He drove away in it that night and was never seen again." The other end of the line went completely quiet. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a stunned silence. I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow. He had never made the connection. In his self-absorbed world, the car was just an object, an antique. It had no history, no soul. Now I had given it one. What are you talking about?" he finally stammered. "You never told me that." "You never asked," I replied, the words landing with surgical precision. "You never cared enough to ask why that hunk of metal in the garage was so important to me. You and your mentor Julian just saw a price tag. You didn't see a memorial. You didn't see the last piece of my brother." "Dad, I didn't know," he whispered. The panic in his voice was now laced with a new, unfamiliar sound, the dawning horror of understanding. "No, you didn't," I said, pressing my small advantage. "Now the police have it and they're asking questions. I have no idea why, Ethan. Maybe the new owner did something. Maybe it was flagged in a database somewhere. But you're the one who sold it. You're the one who signed the papers. So whatever this is about, your name is all over it. You'd better figure out what's going on." I didn't offer to help. I didn't offer comfort. I let him dangle, twisting in the wind of the consequences he had created. He had kicked the legs out from under me when I was at my most vulnerable. Now, I was simply letting him feel the fall. "I have to go, Ethan. My doctor says I need to rest." "No stress," I said, twisting the knife just a little, using the very excuse he had used to justify his actions. I hung up before he could respond, my hand trembling slightly. The confrontation had drained me, but it had also solidified my resolve. The first crack had appeared in Ethan's world. He was scared. He was confused. And for the first time, he was being forced to look past his own selfish needs and see the ghost of the uncle he never knew. The trap was working perfectly. The car was in police custody, and my son was finally beginning to understand that some things have a cost that can't be measured in dollars. Ethan's panic was a fire that Julian Croft immediately tried to extinguish with a bucket of cold cynicism. Ethan called me back the next day, his voice laced with a rehearsed, defiant confidence that I knew wasn't his own. "I spoke with Julian," he announced, as if presenting a royal decree. "He says you're playing games, Dad. He says you're trying to manipulate me because you're angry about the sale. He thinks you called the police yourself." I almost laughed. Julian was smart, but his arrogance was his blind spot. He saw the world as a reflection of his own manipulative nature. And what do you think, Ethan? There was a flicker of hesitation. Julian's a smart guy. He says the police can't do anything. It's a 30-year-old case. There's no evidence. He told me to stay calm and say nothing. That's his advice. To the man whose name is on the bill of sale for a car now central to a police investigation. That sounds like excellent counsel, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm sure Julian has your best interests at heart. The conversation ended there, but I knew Ethan was torn. The seed of doubt I had planted was warring with Julian's poisonous influence. It was a battle for my son's soul, and I had to trust that the truth was a more powerful weapon than Julian's greed. Meanwhile, my own anonymous relationship with the police was deepening. A week after my first call, I received another one, this time from a blocked number. I knew who it was. "This is Detective Harding," the familiar gruff voice said. "I'm not going to ask who this is, but your tip was good. We have the car." "Have you found anything?" I asked, keeping my voice disguised. "We're taking it apart now. It's slow work. Forensics is booked solid. My captain thinks I'm chasing ghosts, wasting department resources on a 30-year-old file. I could use another nudge in the right direction. You said to look for custom work. Anything more specific?" He was fishing, but he was also offering a partnership. He was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was telling him my ghost was real. I had to give him more, enough to justify his investigation and focus his resources. "Check the trunk," I said, my heart pounding. "Behind the left wheel well. There might be a panel there that isn't standard factory issue." "A panel," Harding repeated. "Got it." The line went dead. I had now directly guided them to the evidence. The risk was enormous. If they traced the knowledge back to me, my entire plan could unravel. But it was a risk I had to take. 2 days later, the stakes escalated dramatically. Detective Harding called Ethan and formally requested he come to the station for an official interview. This was no longer a friendly phone call. This was a command. Ethan's bravado shattered. He called me, his voice a terrified whisper. "They want me to come in. Julian said I should get a lawyer, that I shouldn't talk to them. Dad, what's in that car?" The fear in his voice was genuine. Julian's influence was finally cracking under the pressure of real-world consequences. A lawyer would cost money, money Ethan probably no longer had after paying off his debts. Julian's advice was designed to protect Julian, not him. "The truth, Ethan," I said softly. "The truth about what happened to my brother is in that car. Julian Croft doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about you. He just cares about the commission he made from the sale. Are you going to protect him, or are you going to help me fin justice for a member of your own family?" It was a direct challenge to his loyalty, to his character. I didn't know which way he would fall. I didn't have to wait long. The next call I received was from Detective Harding. "Your boy came in," he said, and for the first time I detected a note of something other than professional weariness in his voice. It sounded like respect. He told us everything. About the pressure he was under, about this Julian Croft character, about the sale. He was scared, but he was honest. And he kept saying one thing: my dad just wanted his brother back. A wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy washed over me. Ethan had made the right choice. "We found the panel you mentioned," Harding continued, his voice dropping, "and a small metal box behind it. Inside, a silver locket, and a single strand of hair. The lab is running DNA on it now. We're comparing it against a list of David Reed's known associates from 1990. My breath hitched. "Do you have a suspect?" "We have a primary person of interest," Harding said carefully. "Alastair Finch. He's a big deal in this town now, property developer, philanthropist. But back then, he was a different animal. He was the one your kid's uncle was last seen with. We never had anything to tie him to it. Maybe now we do." The name, spoken aloud by a police officer, was a vindication. The ghost I had been chasing for 30 years was finally taking shape. The spell was broken. Ethan, by telling the truth, had freed himself from Julian's control and unwittingly had become an instrument of justice. The forensic report on that single strand of hair would be the final piece of the puzzle, the irrefutable proof that would bring down a man who had walked free for 3 decades. The final showdown was coming. The call from Detective Harding came on a Monday morning. The sky outside was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the storm that was about to break. "We got a match," Harding said, his voice devoid of any triumph, carrying only the flat weight of certainty. "The DNA from the hair in the locket, it's a definitive match to Alastair Finch. We have enough for a warrant. I'm bringing him in this afternoon." He paused, then added, "I think you should be here, Charles, and your son." It wasn't a request. It was a summons, he knew. I don't know how, maybe Ethan had said something, maybe Harding was just a damn good detective, but he knew the anonymous caller and the grieving brother were one and the same. "We'll be there," I said. I called Ethan. His voice was small, humbled. "Harding already called me," he said. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I can't believe what I did. I almost—" "I know," I said, cutting him off gently. "There would be time for apologies later. I'll pick you up in an hour." When I arrived at his apartment, the door was already open. He stood there with a small overnight bag at his feet, his expensive suit replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. He looked like a boy again, lost and terrified. He didn't speak as he got into my car, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. The police station was a place of quiet, bureaucratic dread. Harding met us at the entrance and led us not to an interrogation room but to an observation room. It was small and dark, with a large, one-way mirror looking into the stark, brightly lit room next door. "Finch is on his way in," Harding explained. "He thinks he's just here to clear up a few things about a historical matter. His lawyer is with him. I want you to sit here. I don't want him to see you, but I want you to see this." We sat in the darkness, watching the empty room. Ethan was rigid beside me, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That man, Julian Croft, he called me a dozen times after I spoke to the police. First, he threatened me. Then he tried to bribe me. He offered me a cut of his next big deal if I would just retract my statement and blame you for everything." "What did you tell him?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the empty chair in the other room. "I told him that my family wasn't for sale," Ethan said, and for the first time in years, I heard the strength of his grandfather, of his uncle, in his voice. A tear rolled down his cheek. "I'm so sorry I learned that so late." Before I could answer, the door to the interrogation room opened. A man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, walked in. He was handsome, with a mane of silver hair and a confident, easy smile. He looked like the philanthropist and community leader he pretended to be. It was Alastair Finch. He was followed by a slick-looking lawyer. Harding entered a moment later, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit but leaned against the far wall, a thick file in his hand. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Finch," Harding began. Finch waved a dismissive hand. "Of course, detective, happy to help clear up any old paperwork. What's this about?" "David Reed," Harding said, the name dropping into the sterile room like a stone. Finch's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, a brief tightening of the muscles around his eyes, betrayed him. "That was a long time ago, a tragedy. The boy just ran off, as I recall." "That's one theory," Harding said, opening the file. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of the Mustang. "Do you recognize this car?" Finch glanced at it. "It looks familiar. I believe it was the one young David drove." "That's right," Harding said. "We recently recovered it, and we conducted a full forensic analysis. It's amazing what modern science can find, even after 30 years. He then slid a small plastic evidence bag onto the table. Inside, the silver locket glinted under the fluorescent lights. Finch stared at it, his composure finally starting to crack. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a rigid stillness. "We found this hidden in a secret compartment in the trunk," Harding said, his voice a low, relentless hammer. "It belonged to David's mother, and inside it, we found a hair that, according to our lab, belongs to you." The room was silent. Finch's lawyer started to speak, but Finch held up a hand to stop him. He stared at the locket, his face pale, his mask of civility stripped away. In the dim observation room, I could feel Ethan shaking beside me. "30 years, Mr. Finch," Harding said. "30 years you've been a pillar of this community. 30 years David's mother and father went to their graves not knowing. 30 years his brother Charles has been waiting." At the mention of my name, Finch's head snapped up, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if he could feel my presence through the mirror. Harding walked to the door. "Alastair Finch, you're under arrest for the murder of David Reed." As two uniformed officers entered to lead a now-ashen Finch away, the final, powerful moment of realization occurred not in the interrogation room but beside me in the dark. Ethan let out a choked sob, a sound of profound grief and catharsis. He had not just witnessed the end of a 30-year mystery. He had witnessed the direct, tangible consequence of his greed and his redemption. He had sold a car, and in doing so, had helped catch a killer. He turned to me, his face a mess of tears and regret. "Dad," he cried, his voice breaking, "what have I done?" I put my arm around my son's shoulders, pulling him close. "You helped me bring your uncle home, Ethan," I said. "You finally helped me bring him home." The arrest of Alastair Finch sent shockwaves through our quiet community. The story of the cold case, solved by a secret hidden in a classic car, was front-page news. Finch, the philanthropist and developer, was revealed to be a monster who had silenced a young man to cover up his criminal past. Faced with the irrefutable DNA evidence, he confessed to everything, detailing how a confrontation with David had turned violent, leading him to hide the body and abandon the car, never suspecting the tiny clue he'd left behind. Justice, after a 30-year delay, was swift and absolute. The fallout for Julian Croft was just as decisive, though it played out in the financial pages instead of the crime blotter. When the story broke, detailing how his predatory advice had led Ethan to sell the critical piece of evidence, his reputation imploded. Clients, seeing him for the soulless opportunist he was, abandoned him in droves. His firm collapsed within a month. I never saw him again, but I heard he left town, a pariah in the world he so desperately wanted to conquer. Ethan faced his own reckoning. He was charged with fraud for the illegal sale of the Mustang, as the title was still in my name. But his complete cooperation with the investigation, his clear remorse, and a quiet word from Detective Harding to the prosecutor's office resulted in a plea deal. He received probation, a hefty fine, which he would be paying off for years, and a permanent mark on his record. His burgeoning real estate career was over before it had truly begun. But his real punishment was not legal, it was moral. The weight of what he had done, of the betrayal he had committed and the justice he had almost prevented, settled deep within him. It changed him. The frantic, ambitious energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber humility. A few weeks after Finch's conviction, the police released the Mustang back to me. It was returned on a flatbed just as I had imagined, but this time it felt different. It was no longer a crime scene, but a survivor. It was delivered to my house, and the driver helped me push it back into its rightful place in the garage. It was in pieces. The interior had been stripped, the panels removed, the engine block exposed. It was a wreck, but a beautiful one. Ethan came over that afternoon. He walked into the garage and stood beside me, looking at the dismantled car. "I'll help you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll help you put her back together. However long it takes, I'll pay for everything." I looked at my son, truly looked at him, for the first time in a long time. I saw not the failed real estate agent or the foolish boy who'd been led astray. I saw a man who had stared into the abyss of his own character and had chosen to climb back out. "I know you will," I said. We went to the cemetery the next day, to the small, simple memorial stone we had placed for David all those years ago. It simply read, "David Reed, beloved son and brother, gone but never forgotten. For years I had come here alone. Now my son stood beside me." I told him all the stories then. The stories of David's laughter, his recklessness, his fierce loyalty. I told him how David had once defended me from a bully twice his size, and how he had spent his entire first paycheck to buy me a rare tool set for my birthday. I filled in the empty spaces of the ghost he had never known, giving him flesh and blood and a soul. When I was finished, Ethan placed a single white rose on the stone. "I'm sorry, Uncle David," he whispered. "I'll make it right." Our own road to reconciliation will be long. The wounds are deep. But as we stood there, father and son, united in a shared grief and a fragile hope, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in 3 decades. The anger was gone. The restless need for answers was gone. Justice had been served, not just for my brother, but for my son, too. That evening we started work on the ghost. I handed Ethan a wrench, and he began carefully and methodically to clean the engine parts. We worked in comfortable silence, the quiet clicks and scrapes of our tools the only sounds in the garage. The car was a wreck, but we would rebuild it, just like our family. It would take time, patience, and a lot of work. But for the first time in a long, long time, I knew we were finally heading in the right direction.